bird on a wire, like a junkie named Midnight Choir. I have tried in my way to be free, like a worm on a hook, like a night in some old-fashioned book. I have saved all my ribbons for thee. If I've been unkind, I hope you can just let it go by. If I've been untrue, I hope you know that it was never to you. Like a baby stillborn, like a beast with his horn, I have torn everyone who reached out for me. But I swear by the song and by all that I have done wrong, I will make it all up to thee. I saw a beggar leaning on his wooden crutch. He said to me, you must not ask for so much. And a pretty lady leaning in her darkened door, she cried out to me, yeah, why not ask for more? like a drunk in a midnight choir. I have tried in to be free.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon again. A little bit more of the housekeeping. Wonderful crowds for the final day of Writers' Week. It's good to see. We'd like everyone to be aware of those around them. When you're running up and down the aisles, try to make sure that you're not just stopping and standing, because it can be inconvenient with so many people trying to move around. During the session, we ask that you do not sit or stand in the aisles. Could you not move the chairs from where they've been placed? If you have your telephone on, could you please switch it to silent to avoid embarrassment in the middle of a session? Also, the chairs are for people, not bags and rucksacks, so that if somebody comes up to you and says, "Is that chair taken?" and all that's in it is a rucksack, then no, it's not taken. It's available to sit in. First come, first serve, basically. Yeah, so as I've said, be aware of other people around you. We've got some quite large crowds here. Enjoy, be nice to each other. Thank you. Something that's been brought to my attention, ladies and gentlemen, which is a very valid comment. On the back of every chair, or not every chair, but most chairs, you'll see a little QR code. That QR code will link you to a donation site where you can help to keep Writers' Week going, keep it open and free. So if you feel that you can afford to donate something to Writers' Week, flick your phone on that QR code and send a little bit in to keep it going. Thank you.
I've had nothing but sorrow since you said we were through. There's no hope for tomorrow. How's the world treating you? Every sweet thing that mattered has been broken into. All my dreams have been shattered. How's the world treating you? Got no plans for next Sunday. Got no plans for today. Every day is Blue Monday. Every day you're away. The
Microphones are live, ready when you are.
Okay, thanks. Hello and welcome to another panel at Adelaide Writers' Week. My name is Marion Wilkinson and I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Garnaut people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Many of you know I'm a journalist who's written a lot of words about climate change, and for me the big question is still, can we end our dependency on fossil fuels in time to safeguard our planet? Which brings me to the title of our panel today, The Planet's Clock is Ticking, and to remarkable Australians who are passionate about how we can make a transition to a net zero world in time to secure our future. Professor Ross Garnaut is probably Australia's most influential thinker and writer today on the economics and business of renewable energy. Ross is a director of Zen Energy. He's also Professor Emeritus at the University of Melbourne and the ANU. Over his long career, Ross has held senior government positions as well, including Principal Economic Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and served as Australia's ambassador to China. But his name became synonymous with Australia's challenge in the face of global warming when the Rudd government, along with all the states and territories, commissioned him to write the Garnaut Climate Change Review. Released in 2008, it became the nation's first real blueprint on the way forward to a greener economy. 2 years later, he served as an independent expert to the Gillard government's multi-party climate change committee and updated that review. But in 2019, with the climate war still raging under Scott Morrison, Ross wrote his groundbreaking book, Superpower, arguing that Australia had the potential to go from a climate change laggard to a leader in the post-carbon world. His latest book, The Superpower Transformation, Making Australia's Zero Carbon Future, is a detailed plan for that vision that draws on expert thinkers around the country. With us also is Simon Holmes. Simon is an energy analyst, a director of the Smart Energy Council, a senior advisor to the Climate and Energy College at Melbourne University. Simon began his career as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. On his return to Australia, he spent more than a decade working to improve farm water management using digital technology. He also became a driving force behind the country's first community-owned wind farm, Hepburn Wind. More recently, Simon, as many of you know, have switched his focus to climate politics, disheartened by the coalition party's never-ending climate wars. Simon decided to harness political and IT knowledge experts to help support independent political candidates who would make climate change a top priority. Climate 200's success has catapulted Simon into the national media spotlight, and his new essay, The Big Teal, argues community independence can transform Australian politics as we strive to deal with this climate crisis. So welcome to both of them. Ross, on the night of the federal election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese embraced your superpower vision, telling Australians in his victory speech, "Together we can end the climate wars, together we can take advantage of the opportunity for Australia to be a renewable energy superpower." Well, almost a year on for the election, do you think the new government is seriously acting on that vision?
Yes, I think it is. And the Commonwealth government, through the Albanese government committing itself to the superpower vision really just joined all of the state and territory governments who were already there. Every state premier had made versions of that commitment, and what the change of government last May did was bring the Commonwealth into the national story. The states were already there. At this Adelaide occasion, I should recall, Marion, that the first time I used the expression and told the story of the superpower was at Adelaide University. I was invited to give a public lecture at the engineering school just down the road in the first half of 2015, and that by that time it had become clear to me that moving faster on movement to zero emissions, using Australia's advantages in renewable energy and in other areas to produce zero carbon goods for the rest of the world meant that we could be richer. We could be on a path to full employment with rising incomes for a growing population for a long time into the future if we embrace the opportunity. That was new. When I did my original climate change review for all the state premiers and the Prime Minister back in 2008, my calculations then suggested there was a cost to moving to zero emissions, but that cost in the first few decades would be far outweighed by the avoided damage later on. Well, as events evolved, as technologies evolved, as our knowledge of the opportunities evolved, by 2015, as I said at the University of Adelaide, no longer was it a cost even in those earlier decades. For Australia, not for every country, but for Australia, there was an opportunity for large economic advantage. That's what the various states have embraced over the past few years. That's what the Prime Minister embraced on election night last year. That's what we can do. And by making use of that opportunity, it will not only make us richer, but it will make it more likely that the rest of the world will get to zero emissions. For the densely populated high-income countries of Northeast Asia and Europe, in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, China, virtually all of Europe, they don't have the renewable energy resources completely to decarbonise their economies. Some things will be very hard. By importing iron processed by renewable energy in Australia, aluminium processed into metal using renewable energy in Australia, they'll be able to make their zero emissions goals when otherwise it would be very hard.
And I want to drill down into that vision very soon. But first I do want to go to Simon on this issue about what has changed and what has not changed. We have seen the coalition, the federal coalition, still dig in opposition to raising our emissions targets, and they're certainly not on board with this idea that Australia can be a superpower in the new energy era. What do you think is blocking this? Why is there such a reluctance to embrace a vision that could put Australia on the path to leadership in this area?
It's a good question. We've seen when people talk about the coalition, they generally think about the federal coalition and ignore the fact that actually it's quite a different attitude towards these issues around the country. The Marshall government in the last government here in South Australia continued basically with policies pretty similar to Jay Weatherall's before that, and and with hardly a beat skipped, the Malakauskas government has picked up the ball without dropping. Every other state, Tasmania's Liberal Party 200% renewable target. I was just talking before about how in Queensland when the Palaszczuk government recently announced that they were going to stop coal power by 2035 from the government-owned generators. rather than being house of derision from the LNP, the Liberal National Party up in Queensland, there was not a whimper. I believe they recognise that their path back to power goes through Brisbane, and they saw what happened at the last federal election, and they know they need it back, and they know that those suburbs, those electorates don't want coal. So it's really just the federal. If you can go around the country, I could give you a similar example in every state. It's really just the federal coalition and the National Party that are having so much trouble with this issue. And I had really hoped that after the election that they would. There's constantly pulls on the coalition, or let's say on the Liberal Party. On one side, you've got their News Corp masters who are trying to drag them further to the right. And then you've got, I think, the political economy. They just lost a whole bunch of seats closer to the centre, and it's pretty obvious for all the demographers are telling them that if they want those seats back, they need to appeal to that group that abandoned them at the last election. So I've been hoping that the Liberal Party would heed the call, start to ignore the hard right news outlets, and embrace, just as we've seen at each of the states one by one. But that hasn't happened, and there have been some comments. I think. Some of the sort of more moderate Liberals in New South Wales, Matt Keane, has commented that one of their biggest problems is that the party is controlled by the branches. And no offence to certain demographic in the audience, but the branches are controlled by largely a small number of conservative men in their 70s. And they don't understand Ross's vision. They're not even aware of what Australia's done, the great strides that we've made in the last decade. So it's I think the branches and the media that they're beholden to are holding back the coalition.
I want to drill down a bit into Ross's vision, and I do urge you, if you haven't got his latest book, it's really worth reading. Ross, I think what is very exciting about what you're trying to lay out is not just that Australia can become a renewable energy leader domestically in this country, but it can become this really significant exporter of clean energy and clean products in manufacturing and heavy manufacturing, and that means big employment opportunities. And I wonder if you could briefly explain to us why that's so. How do we actually do that here?
I spell out in the Superpower Transformation Australia's 5 big advantages in the zero-emission economy. Actually, South Australia has each of those bigger than Australia as a whole. So it's an extraordinary opportunity for South Australia. But I'll just exemplify it by reference to one industry, the iron and steel industry. Australia is by far the world's biggest exporter of iron ore, iron oxide. Japan and Korea have built their whole huge steel industries on the basis of imports from Australia, but also imports of metallurgical coal from Queensland and New South Wales, and they put them together in Japan and Korea and export to the world. China, the world's biggest producer of steel, produces more than half the world's steel, produces a majority of it from iron ore imported from Australia. The single process of turning iron ore, iron oxide, into iron metal alone contributes about 7% of total global emissions. And a very high proportion of that 7% is from Australian iron ore. Well, in the fossil energy economy, we exported the metallurgical coal, we exported the iron, and other countries put it together and made iron, metal, and steel. Well, we won't be doing that, or at least if economics has any say in it, we won't be doing that in the zero emissions economy, because whereas metallurgical coal is relatively easily transported from Queensland ports to Japan or Korea or China or Germany, hydrogen isn't. and electricity can be traded internationally, it will be, probably in significant volumes. But it's very costly. Hydrogen can be exported. Hydrogen made from renewable energy can be exported. And that will be quite an important industry. But the product will be much more expensive, more than twice as expensive at the other end. Why is that the case? Why can we export coal or natural gas and it be reasonably cheaply available in importing countries? About the same cost as here in the case of coal. The reason for that is that hydrogen will not liquefy until you get temperatures almost down to absolute zero, and you use half the energy in hydrogen to get it down to that temperature. And it's the smallest atom and the smallest molecule in nature, and it will seep out between the steel molecules in standard materials. You can build a ship with special materials that will contain it, but that's much more expensive. So it's going to be 2 or 3 times expensive to use Australian hydrogen made from renewable energy in Australia to use it in Korea or Japan or China or Germany as it is to use it here. So the economics will drive us to use our own renewable energy to make hydrogen, to turn our minerals into iron ore. Now, just iron alone is a huge contribution. Processing Australian iron ore alone, just that one process would reduce global emissions by more than twice as much as reducing all other Australian emissions to zero. And it happens that South Australia is very well placed. 11% of the country's iron ore is in this state, but this state has disproportionately the type of iron ore that is most economically turned into metal by using hydrogen, magnetite, and a particular type of magnetite. This state's got nearly half Australia's resource of magnetite. So there's going to be a huge industry in South Australia if we use our opportunity well. Well, that's just one opportunity. We could say smaller in scale, but still huge. There's a similar story for aluminium, where we're the world's biggest exporter of aluminium ores. A similar story, but probably very large scale in the end, turning silicon oxide into silicon metal for photovoltaic panels and computers and so on. At the moment, almost all the world's pure silicon for photovoltaic panels is made in China. It's actually made much more cheaply in Australia because it's a very energy-intensive process. So using this opportunity across the board will be a huge boon for Australian industry, a boon that's simply not there in the fossil energy economy. In the fossil energy economy, the economics drives you just dig it up and ship it out, like Carolyn Kennedy wants us to keep doing, with America becoming the zero emissions superpower. And making use of this opportunity just gives us a path forward to rising incomes for a growing population, full employment for a long time into the future.
Well, you can see that what you're trying to do does need really big vision and really big political vision. Underpinning it is, of course, first of all, Australia rapidly developing its renewable energy sectors. And Simon, this is something that's interested you for a long time. You, in fact, tried to make personal representations to successive energy ministers about pushing along this renewable energy transition. There's always been a reluctance in the coalition parties, obviously not so much in the Labor Party that had a renewable energy target, but there's always been a reluctance to see renewable energy in this country as overtaking fossil fuels. Are we now changing that politically, that mentality, or do you think it's still there?
I think there's hints of a change in moving away from the climate wars. They're still there federally, but I'll give you an example at the state level. In 2018, in Victoria, the Labor Party went to the election with a reasonable renewable energy and emissions target. The Coalition went to the election opposing both of those and proposing a new coal power station in the Latrobe Valley. That was 2018. A month after the federal election just passed, the Coalition changed their policy dramatically to matching Labor Party and legislating a whole bunch of aspirational Labor goals. Labor saw that and jumped up to another level. So it became a race to the top. Rather than this low divide, it was a race to the top. And I gave you that story about in Queensland, where again it's the race to the top, where the LNP don't see that there is political mileage in reflexively opposing. So I think we are seeing a shift, and that a fair bit of that does go with the demonstrated Australian will at the polls. The seats we supported through Climate 200, a community fundraising initiative. 12,000 people contributed to about 23 campaigns around the country. You'd be aware of the 6 quote Teals that got in, but there's also David Pocock and 4 independents who are already in the House. So about 11 on the crossbench, plus all the new Greens that joined, makes a crossbench that's now bigger than the National Party in the lower house. So the changing goalposts for the politicians are there to see. And in the seats that we supported, you'll hear the media saying, climate change is not a top order issue. Well, in the seats that elected Teals at the last election, climate and integrity were both in the top 3 issues across all those seats, generally climate number 1 in those seats. So any party that wants control back of those seats, now it's very obvious for them that they have to lift their game in that area. And I think until we can get out of this oppositional frame and start having the race to the top of seizing the opportunities, we're not going to have the attitudes required to grab this superpower narrative.
And Ross, on that note, I hate to be a pessimist here, but since the Ukraine war, obviously we've seen a huge kickback by the fossil fuel industry. The Financial Times reported the other day that the 6 largest Western oil companies had made more money in 2022 than any other year in the history of the industry. There's now a number of these companies, including companies like Woodside, pushing to invest more money in fossil fuel expansion. Do you think this pushback against a transition to a clean energy economy is going to put a brake on what's happening, a brake on your vision, a brake on the transition?
Well, to jump ahead of the story, Mariam, we can't afford a break because we're behind where we need to be to deal with the problem. It's too early to tell. There are cross currents. The debate's played out most pointedly in Europe, where the loss of the Russian supplies of gas and coal and oil lifted fossil energy prices to very high levels. And there was real debate in the early weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine about deliberate slowing down as a matter of policy of the transition so that they could deal with the energy problem. But where the debate has settled is that in the relatively short medium term, not on day one, but but over the next few years, commitment to a big acceleration of introduction of renewable energy. So that could have gone the other way, but it didn't. And in Europe, we've seen a strengthened commitment to rapid movement to renewable energy. Now, they don't have the resources to get as far as they'd like to, and they will end, Germany and Britain and France will end up having to import green iron from South Australia if they're going to meet their new ambitions. Some of them have worked that out, and some of them are still working it out. But that is the underlying reality. On the points you made at the beginning, yes, these are years of extraordinary profits for the fossil energy industries. I don't begrudge them high profits, although I think that the Australian people who own the gas and the coal in the ground have been unwise to tax it so lightly. Other countries, Norway, other countries with rich fossil energy resources get a lot more money out of them, but we've chosen to not charge much for these very rich natural resources. That's our problem, not theirs. The problem is not them earning profits, given the rules we've set. The problem is them reinvesting those profits in the future. Now, I think that, well, certainly if the world deals with the problem of climate, a lot of those investments, exploration now to build a new LNG field in a few years' time, will be stranded assets. That will be a waste of shareholders' money. And the shareholders, I think, would be better off if those huge profits were given back to shareholders as dividends or share buybacks. So I think the boards and executives of those companies are actually breaching their duties to shareholders. Whether or not that is seen to be correct, we'll all know as a matter of history in a few years' time. But the problem is not so much the extraordinary profits, but the fact that that's being reinvested. That's a mistake for our society. I think it's a mistake for the companies themselves.
Simon, I want to go to you on that, and also this bet that the fossil fuel companies are making against renewable energy in some cases at the moment.
Yeah, well, firstly, on those super profits that Ross referred to, sometimes on Twitter you see adjacent tweets that just by serendipity smack you in the face. You have some realisation. And that happened to me a few weeks ago when I saw a Financial Times link to an article talking about the phenomenal profits that the gas companies in Europe were making. And the very next tweet was talking about record levels of energy poverty in the UK and of pensioners who couldn't heat their homes, and how much the energy segment of the household budget had grown and the stress it was putting on Britons. And what we see there is the gas companies' costs didn't change appreciably during this period. Their profits did, and those profits came from the populace. There was a time when we used to call that war profiteering. There was a time when that was immoral and a form of treason, really, to be profiteering off a conflict. And it's, I think they've done a very poor job in Europe in dealing with that. But in Australia, the same. Queensland government put an extra levy on coal and brought in several $1 billion into the state coffers on that. New South Wales didn't. I saw some analysis the other day that if they had matched Queensland, they would have put their budget, the state budget, into surplus. And obviously that would be to the benefit of all of the programs that could be run as a result. The oil and gas companies are starting to invest in this space. I saw a statistic in Bloomberg the other day that spending on R&D by the major energy companies in the renewable space exceeded the same company's investment in oil and gas for the first time just in the last year. So we're getting to a tipping point. It should be way the other way right now. But there are some significant, there's a massive hydrogen development over in Western Australia, still at the very early stages, but BP bought 40% of the project last year. We're seeing some of the big oil majors are starting to get the message, but while they're making super profits, especially when they can see they might be in their death throes, you can understand why they are doing everything they can to milk every dollar out of it.
I wanted to ask both of you the policy at the moment that's being pursued in Canberra. I'm sure some of you know there's a huge bun fight going on about it. It's a policy called the Safeguard Mechanism, and it's to try and put pressure on big emitting companies to reduce their emissions. It's a very fraught piece of legislation. And Ross, you had mentioned that perhaps no matter what happens with that legislation, there's a cleaner path and a clearer path, which may be that we need to get back to an older policy of the renewable energy target and really hit that. Can you explain what advantages that might have?
Well, just on the safeguard mechanisms, that's a step forward, and it would be a loss of a step forward if that wasn't legislated. So that's very clear. It's an important measure, but it can't be the only measure. And at the moment, since the abolition of the carbon price in 2014, it disappeared July the 1st, 2014. For 2 years before that, when we'd had carbon pricing and as well as a suite of other policies, emissions were falling by 8% per annum in the covered sectors on a trajectory where they needed to be. It wasn't disruptive of the economy. Whyalla was flourishing at that time. There was no wipeout at Whyalla as Tony Abbott promised. In fact, the near wipeout at Whyalla happened after they abolished the carbon price. And after the abolition of the carbon price, the one strong policy that was still in place was the renewable energy target, which was left over from the Rudd government period. Abbott tried to get rid of it and in the end was only able to compromise and reduce it. But even at a reduced level, it kept things going quite strongly for a number of years. Well, that's run out of steam. That it stopped being powerful recently. And recently, the main power has come from voluntary use of full renewable energy and purchase of renewable energy certificates, entirely voluntary, the action now. That won't continue to get us there. And so in the absence of a carbon price, we need some other large policy to drive the movement to full use of renewable energy. And as I say in the superpower transformation, the straightforward policy is one that's very familiar. We all know how it works. We're very comfortable with it. We know it does work, the renewable energy target. Let's strengthen it. Let's extend it. And let's set parameters that guarantees that Anthony Albanese's 82% renewables by 2030 actually happens. At the moment, it's a very powerful commitment, but there's no policy to make it happen. Extension of the renewable energy target and recalibration can make it happen. We should do that. We have to do that to maintain momentum in the absence of a carbon price. The safeguards mechanism in itself is a good thing. It'd be better if it was better, but more important is the bigger economy-wide drivers of change, and the renewable energy target is the best we've got.
Simon, do you think that we could get the political will to push that forward?
Yeah, so just to understand the scale of the issue, in the last 7 years, we've increased the amount of renewables in Australia by about 50 terawatt hours a year. Now, what's a terawatt hour? Well, 50 terawatt hours is about what Victoria users in an average year. So it's almost as if we've turned Victoria 100% green, but of course spread out across the country. So that's the last 7 years. We have to do twice that in the next 7 years in order to meet the government's target. But whereas we had a policy, the renewable energy target, which was wonderfully bipartisan, by the way, to start with. It was introduced by John Howard. It was supported by Labor all the way through to 2007 election. Both parties went to the election to increase the target. When it finally went through in 2010, I remember Greg Hunt from the Liberal Party berating Labor for taking so long to increase renewables. So we had this strong bipartisan policy. It did start to fracture, as Ross mentioned, but the renewable energy industry, and South Australia was a great beneficiary, grew so much, especially in the last 7 years. Now, this next 7 years, we want to grow twice as fast, but we don't have any federal policy. We've got bits and pieces of small policies around the country, but we don't currently have a clear policy framework that will deliver that. And if we can't get the 82% renewable, then we can't hit the 43% emissions reduction. So it's critical we do that. I think it's difficult to talk about now because there's been this long campaign that renewables will drive the costs up. In fact, all the analysis and all the reports that have been done, and the reason why Abbott couldn't kill the renewable energy target is because all these reports come back saying actually the renewable energy target gives certainty to producers to install the renewables. Once they're built, they bring the average cost of energy down, and the net result on society is a benefit. But right now is a challenging environment where people are feeling so much bill pressure. Even though more renewables would drive it down, right now it's probably a political win, it's a political football that the Labor government doesn't want to have in play with the Liberal opposition. But I think we will see over the next year or so people starting to come around to this realisation that we need to have more than just a safeguards mechanism. It's, as Ross said, it's really important. Safeguard mechanism I see as it's like The Voice. It's really important for the issue that it addresses, that it moves forward, and if it were to fall apart, then we easily could lose a decade. So I think it's really important for people to get behind it and to support people like David Pocock in the Senate who are tweaking and trying to get the best possible outcome from what's ultimately a bunch of compromise.
I want to look in the short period we've got left. I do want to talk about some big international issues here that will affect us enormously as we try and see whether we can pursue this vision of Australia becoming a leader in clean energy. And one is an issue that on its surface, everyone cheered at its introduction, which was the Inflation Reduction Act in America, the oddly sounding piece of legislation in America, but that put hundreds of billions of dollars into renewable energy in America. It was cheered by the global environment movement, but actually, when you examine it, it's not particularly good news for Australia. And Ross, I'd like you to try and explain that and what we can do about it.
As I've already referred to Carolyn Kennedy, the US ambassador's comments yesterday in the Financial Review, cheering the IRA. And the problem with it is a huge commitment to decarbonisation of the United States, but it's structured in a highly protectionist way. There's a huge subsidy for electric vehicles, but they have to be made in America. So it's keeping out European and Japanese and Korean and Chinese cars. There's a huge subsidy for making hydrogen, but it's made in America, hydrogen. Their subsidy of $3 US a kilogram is higher than the whole cost of making hydrogen if you use renewable energy well in the Upper Spencer Gulf in South Australia. Trump trashed the rules-based international economic system, trashed it. and Biden has kept it trashed. Just getting in the road of open international trade. So something that is, I'm sure, in Biden's mind and in the US Congress's mind, it's seen as a major step forward for renewable energy, and for decarbonisation in the United States it is, but it's done in such a way that it excludes value-added processes in the rest of the world, excludes Australian hydrogen, excludes German motor vehicles, electric vehicles. And that's a pity, because we're going to need an open international trading system to deal with the problem, to deal with the problems of Europe and Northeast Asia, the problem of them not having rich renewable energy resources. We need a lot of international trade, exports from us of the things that we can do better. Carolyn Kennedy yesterday said, oh, don't complain about what we've done, do it yourselves. Well, there's several reasons why we can't do it. First, Charles de Gaulle, when he was president of France, talked about the exorbitant privilege of the US having the international currency. They can just print money to pay for $560 billion of US dollars of subsidies for the renewable energy sector. Other countries can't. Their budget, their public debt, their federal government debt is 3 or 4 times Australia's as a share of the economy. And it's no problem for them. They just print more US dollars and someone will hold them. It is a problem for us. Carolyn, I'm sure, has a wonderful heart, but her instruction to us just to do the same is actually not practical. We're going to need an open international trading system for this to work. Now, will the IRA in the US actually stop global progress? Probably not, because it will accelerate the decarbonisation of North America, and that is a wonderful thing. That's a great thing. I would be most surprised if a US president wanted to go to the Congress in a couple of years' time and saying, I want another $500 billion so that we can produce hydrogen to decarbonise Japan and Korea and China. That's not going to happen. So that in the medium and longer term, the opportunity is still going to be there for us to do what is economically sensible and play that role. But there's a lot of mud in the water in the meantime. I hope we won't be too much distracted by that. I hope we don't turn our minds too much to what's happening in the US. The main game for us is the role we can play in decarbonising through manufacturing processes here in Australia, the role we can play in decarbonising the high-income, densely populated countries of Northeast Asia and Europe.
Well, I would like to come back to our theme of the clock is ticking on this, and there has been a lot of concern, as we all know, by climate scientists that we are going too slowly on this transition, and that it's going to be very hard for us to keep global warming to the 1.5 degree target, the target that we hoped in Glasgow the world would aim for. Simon, as you're looking at the kind of progress we're making, and you've been looking at this energy transition for quite some time now, how confident are you, as the clock ticks, that we're going to get there, even in Australia, that we have got the vision to get there?
People often talk about saving the planet, or the planet's clock is ticking, and I like to think that the planet will do just fine without us. It's not the planet's clock's ticking, it's our clock that's ticking. And Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, puts it really well when he says that winning slowly is losing. It's a bit depressing. We have been winning slowly, but we have been accelerating. We've made more progress in the last few years than we made in the decade before that, and we're on track to accelerate. The global investment in the decarbonisation is increasing exponentially. So we are winning too slowly, but we're accelerating, and the light at the end of the tunnel is becoming a brighter and brighter light. So I'm still an optimist. I'm certainly an optimist because I know that I'm not alone. We saw at the last federal election, we saw there were 23 communities that put forward an independent candidate, stood up. 20,000 Australians came out on election day to volunteer for them. We're wearing the T-shirts, and as you saw, 11. So 10 in the lower house and 1 in the Senate, who are all really strong on shifting the dial in Australia. In New South Wales, there's an election in 2.5 weeks. There's a number of candidates. Earlier today, they came out and said that if there's a minority government, which is most likely in New South Wales, the one thing that they all agree on is that the state has to put an end to the fracking in the Pilliga Forest and the pipelines through the livable plains. One of our primary agricultural areas is being threatened with a gas pipeline coming through that. So we're starting to see people understand their power. People starting to re-engage with democracy, and I think that that's the most important actions we can take are not the recycling our soft plastics, but getting the right people around the table in all of our decision-making bodies. And I'm really glad that Australians have embraced that. Gives me a lot of hope.
Ross, I'd like to take you to the global outlook on this. In fact, you were one of the Australians who popularised the idea of a carbon budget in the world and us having to live within a carbon budget. And whenever this comes up, we're always told China and India are going to overwhelm us, that it's all too difficult. It's an area that you've looked at again and again. How optimistic are you feeling that not only Australia, but countries like China can also meet the carbon budget that we've got left?
Well, in the book, Superpower Transformation, there's a chapter by Malte Meinhausen, Rebecca Burton and others on exactly this question, so I commend that from the book. But Malte Meinhausen, one of the leading world figures in atmospheric physics, advising the IPCC on global budgets, he says in there that he's more optimistic than he's ever been, largely because of the progress in the technologies of dealing with it. It's become easier and cheaper, the progress in renewable energy. So in a most fundamental sense, although politically we haven't moved like we should have done, like it would have been in our interest to do, the technological improvement's gone faster than we expected, and that actually brings forward the time when a successful outcome is possible. But on the big countries, China, these days by far the biggest emitter in the world, the biggest producer and user of almost every material. So what happens there is crucial. China adopted a new model of economic growth that was going to give greater emphasis on this in 2013, and they did make progress for a few years. There was a very big setback during the trade wars with the Trump administration, but they are making considerable progress. There's more renewable energy going in every year by far in China than in anywhere else in the world. That they have to go faster. China did something new at the Glasgow meeting at the end of 21. It put a firm target for zero emissions on the table. It said by 2060. India did something new. It put on a target by 2070. Indonesia did something new, put it on a target by 2060. Now, the world as a whole has to get to net zero by 2050 if we're to achieve 1.5 degrees. The developed countries are now, Australia was the last. Australia was the one holdout, along with Russia and Saudi Arabia and Syria. But we stopped holding out in Glasgow. We committed ourselves to zero emissions by 2050. So that's now the commitment of all developed countries. Developed countries have also committed to going faster and reaching zero earlier than the other countries. The arithmetic still adds up. If the developed countries bring forward their date by 5 years, I'd go through all this in the book, 2045. China has to come forward 5 years, 2055. India has to come forward by 5 years, 2065, and most other developing countries are in that same space as India. The arithmetic then adds up. Now, it is actually quite possible for us to, certainly Australia, certainly any country, even with poor renewable energy resources like the European countries, to get there by 2045. They're more likely to get there. Europe and Northeast Asia, with a lot of trade with us, buying green iron from us, green aluminium from us, green silicon from us. They're more likely to get it. Will help a lot if we can help that, but it's quite possible. The Russian war is a big disruption. It's not only what's happened to energy markets, but it's taken a lot of international attention. And Russia itself is quite a big player in these things. And we're not out of the chaos on the border of Russia yet. But we can't easily predict the continuing influence of that. Put that aside. I'm actually not pessimistic about the developed countries getting to zero by 2045, China by 2055, India and other developing countries by 2065. So put me down as someone who still thinks it can happen.
Well, that's good to hear. I'd like to see whether anyone has some questions for the panellists. And I think there are. Yes,
Good
go
afternoon.
ahead.
Thank you for your address. I have two questions. One is the export of hydrogen as ammonia a feasible solution? And the other question is about the Laptev Sea, which is part of the East Asian continental shelf. There's apparently 50 million tonnes or more of methane leaking out of the sea, and that seems to me a problem.
Okay, well, I think, Ross, I might start with you certainly on the first issue about
Yes, ammonia is easier to... Ammonia is made from hydrogen and a lot of energy and nitrogen from the atmosphere. You can make ammonia from hydrogen and then put it in a boat, at the other end turn it back to hydrogen. You can do that, and that's actually cheaper than liquefying hydrogen and building a special ship to take that. So that's going to be important in international trade. It's still very expensive, and hydrogen transported in ammonia will be much more expensive than using the hydrogen here in Australia, so it doesn't change the story. On the methane, sorry, I follow a lot of things. I'm not right up with the Northeast Asian continental plain leakage of methane.
So we'll have to pass on that one, sorry. Next question.
Ross and Simon, like yourself, the eminent English economist Kate Raworth has a vision for a better economic future. But in Kate Raworth's case, she very much argues that we need to combine decarbonising with also tackling issues of inequality and injustice. Kate Raworth also is rather critical of imagining, I say, a future Australian superpower that might, in fact, still be relying upon endless growth and fundamentally trickle-down economics. So Kate Raworth, in her work, really suggests we need to combine dealing with two issues rather than simply one to be effective on either.
I think we get the question there. I might throw that to Simon first, because of your sort of political interest in how this transition is going as well.
Yeah, certainly inequality is a massive issue to the health of our democracy, to the health of our society, and I think Kate's right to focus on it and look at the synergies with decarbonisation. I'm not yet convinced that of the arguments that they are mutually dependent, that you need to solve one to solve the other and vice versa. But I am convinced that there are many opportunities in solving, that each of them can be synergistic. One example I've heard of is, I know of two very large hydrogen projects in Australia that are gearing up to produce hydrogen for steel making or ammonia production. Both of them are on lands with native title and have entered into we've had this tradition in Australia of sort of build, own, operate, transfer projects like tollways that at the end of 30 years they're transferred to the government. In these cases, at the end of the first 30 years of the project's transferred to traditional owners. Traditional owners will get a share of the projects up front, and there'll be employment opportunities. So the decentralisation of our energy system means a broader range of communities that can get involved, but we have to do it better than we've done it before with other industries when they've moved out into areas with strong traditional ownership. So there are opportunities, definitely. I would agree with Kate on that, and I look forward to learning more about what she says.
On inequality, that's my last book, February 2021, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. I didn't discuss that here because of COVID.
One last question.
Ross and Simon, but I guess more in particular to you, Simon. I wonder if you could answer this conundrum in relation to the mention of green aluminium. Now, aluminium, as you both know, is made from bauxite, and the best bauxite available is under the Jarrah Forest in Western Australia. Now, for Alcoa to get this bauxite, they clear fell and have looking to clear fell more of the Jarrah Forest to the extent that its survival is at risk. Now, Alcoa say they are...
I'll just cut you off there. I think Simon knows quite a bit about this, so can you just get to the... And the question is...
Well, the conundrum is it the Jarrah Forest or aluminium in terms of decarbonisation and the increase in emissions?
Yeah, I've got a couple of insights into this. My family's farm is right in that area. I grew up spending a lot of time in that Jarrah Forest and seeing, in fact, the hill that our family farm's on is a Alcoa pegged out mining lease, and one day if the bauxite price gets to a certain amount, they've got every right to come in and dig it up. So I'm familiar with the area and love the Jarrah forests. Green aluminium and, if we call it brown aluminium, use the same amount of bauxite. So it's not a function of whether it's green or not. It's really a function of responsible mining. Something, which I think is a really big issue, especially since Australia has a massive opportunity in what we call critical minerals in aluminium, copper. Ross mentioned before, nickel, rare earths, etc. Australia has a huge opportunity in becoming major suppliers of this. Lithium, we produce about half the world's lithium in Australia, which is just amazing when you think of all the electric vehicles and laptop batteries and mobile phones. About half that lithium comes from Australia. Our challenge is to learn how to do mining better. I'm first to say I think there's so much evidence of mining that could have been done a lot better, and I feel very much with you on protecting those jarrah forests.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. I'd ask you to support our terrific authors by buying their books. They'll be over at the signing tent after this. But could you please give a big thank you to Ross Garnaut, Simon Holmes Court. Thank you.
Do you think of returning? How's the world treating you? Do you think of returning? How's the world treating you?
I found my own true love was on a blue Sunday. She looked at me and told me I was the only one in the world. Now I have found my girl. My girl awaits for me in tender time. My girl is mine. She is the world. She is my girl. La 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 la. My girl awaits for me in tender time. My girl is mine. She is the world. She is my
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.